Good afternoon, all. For those that do not know me well, my name is Dave MacPherson, and I am a seventh generation Unitarian Universalist, and I had the honor of calling the Reverend David Hicks MacPherson my grandfather. When asked to select a chalice lighting for this memorial service, I knew I had to find a reading that set the tone for the service, as well as truly capturing the essence of my grandfather. I knew that finding the perfect words would be a daunting task, but the right words found me, and came from a familiar source, Gordon Bucky McKeeman. Bucky was a great friend of my grandfather's. In both their personal and professional lives, these two men loudly proclaimed universalism and were beloved by their families and congregations. Within these words by my grandfather's beloved friend, Bucky McKeeman, I hear my grandfather's voice, charging us to continue to bring light into the darkness and spread the beauty of Unitarian Universalism to the world. Let There Be Light by Gordon Bucky McKeeman. Let there be light. Let it shine in dark places, in moments of pain, in times of grief, and the darkness of hatred, violence, oppression, where there is discouragement and despair. Wherever darkness is put to flight, let there be light.
Hello, everyone, and blessings as we come together to celebrate Reverend Dave's life. The tune we just heard, the Hussite Freedom Song, was one of Reverend Dave's favorite tunes. He had Margaret Stokely transcribe it from a phonograph. He asked me to play it on countless occasions, as it held personal meaning to him in both his studies of history and religion. See, the song arose in the 15th century in what we now call the Czech Republic, as the Hussites rose to fight a religious civil war, wanting the right to practice their view of Protestantism against the dictations of Catholicism. A war that began when peaceful protesters marched in the streets of their hometown, only to be met by stones thrown at them and lives lost. Reverend Dave loved talking about the war, and he loved talking about all of history, and he loved talking about freedom, a concept he believed we should all fight for. The song was also featured in an early 20th century movie, starred by Paul Robeson, telling the story of an African-American man brought into Western white culture as a famed opera singer, only to feel alienated by his African lineage in a sea of white fans. A role that Robeson spoke of as honestly portraying his experience as a Black man in a white world. The story concludes as he finds out that he's the ancestor of kings, and he returns to his people in a position of royalty, where he combines Western technology with African love and tradition. While reviewed at the time as being sentimental and absurd, I believe Reverend Dave held an emotional attachment to the movie and the song, seeing it as support of his dream of realizing heaven on earth for an entire global human family, a dream he inspired me to believe, and giving me the tools not just to metaphorically, but literally lift Black voices as they are, without my Western influence, to listen to them and allow them the regality that was stolen from them by mine own ancestors. That massive Black Lives Matter pin that he wore everywhere, it wasn't just a decoration to him. It was a call to action, just as the Hussite Freedom Song was to the Hussites and to Robeson's character in the movie. The opening words to the song, freedom, freedom. Next, we'll be sharing with you a song from the Philippines, who in a similar bond with the Hussites removed themselves from the rule of Catholicism, albeit without a civil war, demanding a free and responsible search for truth and meaning on their islands, and they turned to universalism in the mid-20th century. This song, Maglepe Universalist, is another one of Dave's favorites that he asked me to play all the time. When translated to English, it asks us to be joyful universalists, another one of Reverend Dave's calls and wishes for us all, that he taught with a loving heart.
I'd like to share with you my father's version of the Unitarian Universalist principles. He reorganized them in 1958 because he felt that our goal as a denomination needed to be first and forefront, and also that it needed to tell how we were going to achieve this goal. He hadn't actually added the eighth principle on, but he was absolutely thrilled that as a denomination, we were looking to include dismantling racism into our official Unitarian Universalist principles. We come here to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, by witnessing for the worth and dignity of every person, compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement of spiritual growth, a free and responsible search for truth, the use of the democratic process, and the reverence for the interdependent web of life, which all are a part. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. May it be so.
If you paint me blue, cerulean September sky, there must be a yellow sun and something far and passing by, where I am made of all of this, a mother's love, a lover's kiss, my brother's pain, a dove fist, and more, above the sparkle of the sea, render me that distant thing, over hues of blues and greens, a glint of gold on fleeting wings, where I am made of all of this, a mother's love, a lover's kiss, my sister's struggle to persist, and more than the hand that moves the broad brush strokes of destiny, more than you can fill in the rest of me. Frame me with translucent time, a moment like no other. Paint how you will this life of mine, a melody in colors, for I am made of all of this, a mother's love, a lover's kiss, my brother's pain, a dove, a fist, and more, and more.
The last time I spoke to my Uncle David was on the night of his birthday, September 23rd, 2 days before he died. We talked for an hour and a half, which was a bit of a longer than usual phone call for us. I sang him happy birthday all the way through, and during the conversation we laughed and we cried, which was pretty normal. At one point, he told me he was ready to die. I knew this already because he'd been saying it for years. We'd heard it before. This time, though, he told me how good he felt, knowing that we were all okay and in good places in our lives. Diana had a great job and was with Greg, who was a fantastic guy. Erin was flourishing in her career that she loved, and Ian was home from serving the country and had been using some of the tools he'd given him. These were some woodworking tools of my grandfather's, and it gave Uncle David a deep joy to know that Ian was cherishing these tools that had been in his father's hands and in his own. I am so grateful for everything I was given. where and when I grew up and with the family I had, he said. And if you ever talk to Uncle David, you've probably heard him say this too. He grew up on Charnwood Road in Somerville, Massachusetts, the youngest of the 3 MacPherson boys. They lived in a 2-family house that his Uncle Carlton had built. His father, Harold, was a master plumber who had served and gotten hit with mustard gas in France during the First World War. And his mother, Doris, was the one who held down the home. I'm sorry I never got to know them. Over the years, though, I heard stories from Uncle David, his oldest brother, Robert, and my dad, Wally. I am one of the few people now who can accurately report that the MacPherson household in the 1930s and 40s was clearly a raucous place to be. I heard all 3 of them tell the same jokes that their father told them. He was clearly a character. They had 2 cats, Pat and Mike, that they loved, but also seemed to need to tease by walking the cat around on 2 legs. They got their favorite dessert on their birthday, which for Uncle David was a maple frosted cake. My dad told me about antics that featured him and Uncle David, both pranksters at heart, ganging all their youthful energy up on Robert, who was the straight man of the group. They short-sheeted his bed, moved his things to lead him to believe he'd lost them, and made excessive noise when he was trying to study. And this lasted as long as they could get away with it, it seemed, which was usually about when their mother found out. And then the sound of her yelling, "Harold!" could be heard down the block. Interestingly enough, my grandfather seemed to have taken the side of Uncle David and my dad. They had their family dynamics set. Uncle David's childhood was pretty idyllic by his account. They had Sunday dinners with the family after church. They listened to the Lone Ranger, Fibber McGee and Molly, and The Shadow on the radio. They took trips to historic sites, and they visited the family in Falmouth, Mass, where they could all do target shooting. It was also a life that was centered around the West Somerville Universalist Church. Every summer they went to Ferry Beach, the Universalist camp in Maine. It's clear how much of his grounding came from those days and those people. I was lucky enough to know one of them. Alice Harrison, Reverend Dr. Alice Harrison, offered religious education for teenagers both at Ferry Beach and at her church in Lynn, Mass, where she was the first female RE director. I got to know her when I moved to Boston for grad school and started attending First and Second Church in Back Bay. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she actively encouraged Universalist youth to consider ministry. The day I met her, I was speaking to the minister, introducing myself, when she overheard me. And she came right up, interrupted us, and started excitingly telling me she knew my dad, she knew my uncles, she knew my grandparents, and she was so glad that my uncles had gone into ministry. His youth seems to have been one which was full of love and full of being held. He was held by family and held by the church community. And I think we can see how this translated into his life's work. In this last conversation, we talked, of course, about my late aunt, his beloved Dottie. They met in high school, and as Uncle David said, that was it. She was the one. I went to Richmond for a visit in the 1980s, and when I got back, I told my dad how amazingly affectionate they were, especially for a couple that had been together for so many years. And he told me that's how they've always been since the minute he met her. And so it was. Uncle David also told me a story about some nights when, after visiting Dottie, he had missed the last streetcar and had to walk home. I'd heard this from my dad too. I'm not sure about Uncle Robert, but I do know that for a fact that my dad and Uncle David on more than one occasion ended up walking miles just to get home after spending a night out late visiting their beloveds. But the detail I hadn't heard until September 23rd was that when entering the house, they sometimes discovered that their dad was asleep with the door to the bedroom open. And this was tricky because, as they well knew, their dad slept with a gun under his bed. Now, apparently, they developed an art to, in limbo-style fashion, slink their way in past their parents' bedroom door. After graduating high school, he went to Tufts, that famous Universalist school, conveniently right up the road. Tufts led to Crane Theological School, which took him into his life in the ministry. When Uncle Robert died 2 years ago, in his eulogy, I recounted not having seen much of my uncles when I was a little kid, and how in my 20s, I decided to reach out. At the time, I was considering a career in ministry, since my lineage was Asa MacPherson, literally son of a parson. It meant it was in my family's blood. And I decided I wanted to know these men as family. And from then on, I had very special bonds with both. And though I never got ordained, I feel as called as I ever was, and as engaged in ministry as I ever wanted. And much of this is because of the man we're saying goodbye to. I am who I am because of my family, all my people. He and I saw so much of the world the same way, and we spoke the same language. He just got me. When we last spoke, he told me he'd been thinking about sermons again and that he had 3 more sermons he wanted to write. After all those years in ministry, I finally know what I should be saying, he said. And I laughed at this, and I told him to write them, and that I would help him find a place to get him out in the world. When I've told people this story, they ask me if he told me what they were going to be about. He didn't. He didn't, but we can guess. Even if we don't know the words, we know what would have been behind them. Some people leave bigger holes than others. He leaves behind a chasm. Thank you for loving me, Uncle David. I promise I will keep up the work of putting love in the world and creating heaven on earth.
Peace be with you, and also with me.
With me. We lift our thanks and praise, for in peace we find love.
Love be
With you.
and also with me.
With me.
We lift up our
We
love.
lift with thanks and praise, for with love we can seek justice. Justice be for all, the poor, the hungry, forgotten. We're one human family, for when all are seen as equal, heaven will build
Peace be
with you.
and also with me.
With me. Let us give each other a sign of peace.
I know it's often said that when a person dies, they're not truly gone because they live on in us. They live on in our memories, and because of that, we never lose them. We hold on to them. I will always have the memories of my sister and I playing as a kid out in Goochland, growing up in Ashland, going to visit my granddad, him coming to see us and support us in high school, in college, as my sister graduated, as I went into the Marine Corps, her first year teaching, whenever we'd come home and all be together on holidays. He was always so proud of us as his grandkids. And I'll never lose that. As long as I live, I'll have that memory of my granddad. But what makes me even happier is knowing that there are hundreds, thousands, probably, I think it's no small stretch to think tens of thousands of people who were affected by him, who also hold memories of him and his message that he spread through over 60 years of ministry of love, caring, justice, equality, his message of standing up for what you believe in, for helping those in need, and being the change that you wish to see in the world. None of these are original ideas or original concepts. And myself, like many others, heard that from so many other places than just him. But his actions truly spoke louder than words, and he lived those out every day. So as I move forward in life, and as we all move forward, it's beautiful for me to think that, yes, I have a happy memory of my grandpa, but he's not just living in my memories, he's living in my future as well. In my future, as I make decisions, as I attempt to be the change I wish to see in the world, knowing that he's still living on in my actions, in my future, and knowing that there's thousands, tens of thousands of people out there doing the same thing, that he lives on in them, is the happiest memory I could hope for.
I've really struggled with what to share with you all during my dad's memorial service. I wanted to show the whole person, not just the minister, not just the minister emeritus, but also the father and grandfather. So there are some pictures of my brothers when they were born, me, all of us as kids, my kids, Duncan's kids. I think my children did a fabulous job being in the car with my parents going around to all these historical places. I don't think my brothers and I were that excited about it, but my kids really enjoyed that. So I included some of those pictures. Many of them don't show my dad, but that's because he was there taking the pictures as well. And of course, my mom features prominently in there because they were absolutely inseparable from the time they met when they were 17 until my mom passed away in 2005. One of the legacies that I see going forward is my dad's passion about social justice work. So there are some pictures from the March on Washington. And there are things we don't have pictures for, like desegregating the playground in Maryland. The carousel that was at the Smithsonian for many, many years actually came from that playground. I just learned about that myself a few years ago. My dad was particularly pleased with being able to overcome some barriers and create the beginnings of friendships with some of the residents at Imperial Plaza who had vastly different views of politics and religion than he did. So that example that he set for us in how to create beloved community, that's what I want to hold on to from my dad's legacy. Thank you.
If you know Ian, you know that my brother loved our grandfather. If you knew my grandfather, you know that my grandfather could not have been prouder of Ian. Almost every time I saw my grandfather, he would say something about how proud he was of us. Additionally, my grandfather never missed an opportunity to support our education, whether it was attending various school functions for us or taking us to museums and historical sites. This love of education within our family played a huge part in my decision to become a teacher. My great-grandfathers were both in World War I, and Ian made the courageous decision to join the Marines in the fall of 2013. Ian followed in our great-grandfather's footsteps by being at Parris Island, South Carolina for boot camp and many trainings. For Christmas 2018, Ian presented his sergeant chevrons to our grandfather with this note. For Christmas 2019, I chose to preserve this note as well as many other family photos and memorabilia from our family history in a scrapbook. Ian's note said, "This is one of the sergeant chevrons I was promoted with. When we are promoted, it's tradition to be promoted with chevrons from someone older who was influential in your leadership or as a mentor. As you have always been that to me, I wanted you to have this one. I wish I could be here to see you open it, but I will be home soon. End of next month. Love always. Being decent. Sergeant MacPherson, Ian."
The relationship I had with Dave, was, I'm sure, as I stated, is common to so many people, because I felt like I had a special relationship with him, that there were things that we could talk about that I couldn't talk about with anyone. And I'm sure there are many people who could say the same thing, because his breadth of knowledge was just fantastic and remarkable. And his recall of it, even at 91, 92, his recall of all of that it's remarkable. He was guided through all of that history. Born in 1928 to 2020, what an incredible span of life to be represented in the United States history. Born into the Depression, and then to see the rise to world dominance of the United States culture, and then to see it get where it is today. And I'm so sorry that he wasn't able to make it to vote in an election that he cared so deeply about. But he was guided by the UU principles through his entire life, and he gave his life to those principles in a different order, of course, because Dave was a different order. You know what I'm talking about. I imagine Dave smiling and chuckling, because I saw a lot of that when we talked. But Dave, we want to thank you for this remarkable life, this considered life across all those years. I want to thank you for leaving me with your incredible daughter. But we're feeling you. I can't believe I can't call you up and ask you, when did you learn about that? Or how did people think about this, etc., etc. You're taking so much knowledge with you. But we thank you for your life, and we are feeling you. And we will for the rest of ours.
I wanted to share a few more humorous remembrances of my dad with you all. Of course, after I started recording, I started thinking of more things. For example, and I don't think there's any photographic evidence of this, which is probably a good thing. My dad loved building models, that we know, and we have lots of pictures of all of his models, many of which are carefully boxed up in the attic at the moment, waiting for new homes. But he also liked building model rockets and model boats especially. And he would build, I'm the youngest, so he would build models frequently with my older brothers. And then we would take them out to some sort of body of water and set them on fire. These are things you don't realize are very odd things until you start telling other people and look at their reactions. The one that I did know we got in a lot of trouble for with my mom, we would frequently hear, "Don't tell your mother, don't tell your mother," if she wasn't with us on something. But there was one, and it must have been made of plastic or whatever. And for whatever reason, my dad and brothers decided it was going to be a good idea to float it in the bathtub of the house and set it on fire. That was a hot mess. I mean, the house smelled horribly, and there's black smoke everywhere. I mean, it's incredible. We just had such a unique childhood, along with his civil rights work. There was also, I'm sure, a lot of files on him for being a, quote unquote, troublemaker. So we all were raised with the notion that if you saw a dark sedan and men in suits getting out with cameras, that you get out of there. And to this day, I still don't like to have my picture taken. But we would see something that looked like a government car, and we would all kind of slink into the background and disappear. And I remember learning how to answer the phone when my dad and an interfaith group were taking on the Undertakers Association of Virginia. They were trying to require them to have to give an itemized breakdown of costs prior to a funeral. And there were death threats. You know, when we answered the phone, we knew exactly how we needed to answer the phone and what to do if it was a threatening phone call. So, you know, as a teenager and a young adult, I'm chatting with friends about stuff and realized nobody else had these things happening. So those are some more of the more humorous remembrances. And there are tons more. I mean, who knew that you weren't supposed to climb on the tanks at Aberdeen Proving Ground? I remember distinctly sitting on the turret of a tank while my brother was inside turning the crank and having the turret move around. And then later on in life, discovering that, no, of course they didn't let kids climb all over the tanks. I guess my dad figured that was the best way to learn about them. But again, that was followed with, don't tell your mother.
Just as long as I have breath, I will answer yes to life. Though with pain I make my way, still with hope I meet each day. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to life. Just as long as vision lasts, I will answer yes to truth. In my dream and in my dark, always that elusive spark. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to truth. Just as long as one